Some people mistake a neighborhood title for unlimited authority. That morning, one woman was about to learn the difference. The sharp crack of safety glass snapping through the warm Saturday air reached my ears before I even made it to the front porch. The smell of charcoal from the grill mixed with fresh-cut grass and the faint scent of motor oil drifting from the driveway as I shoved open my front door. My heart skipped when I saw Linda Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, standing beside a dark blue Ford F-250 with a bright orange emergency hammer still clenched in her hand. Tiny crystals of shattered glass sparkled across the concrete like ice under the Texas sun, while a small crowd of neighbors watched from their perfectly trimmed lawns without saying a single word. Linda looked completely comfortable, almost proud of herself, as if she had just completed another routine neighborhood inspection instead of crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Her white Lexus sat idling near the curb, the engine humming softly while her golf cart security volunteer held up a phone, recording everything with a smug grin. "Commercial trucks aren't welcome here," Linda announced loudly enough for every house on the street to hear. "Community standards apply to everyone." I stopped halfway down my walkway, feeling the rough texture of the concrete beneath my boots while the afternoon breeze carried the smell of fresh barbecue from my backyard. The truck belonged to my guest, not me, and it had been parked for less than 20 minutes. There were no warning stickers, no violation notice, no conversation. Just a public display meant to remind everyone who she believed ruled this neighborhood. I looked toward the patio where my guest had stepped inside only moments earlier to help me carry drinks for our cookout. He had driven 300 miles just to spend a quiet weekend catching up after years of busy schedules. Around here, nobody knew his profession. To everyone else, he was simply an old friend arriving in a dusty pickup wearing faded jeans, worn leather boots, and a baseball cap that had seen better days. That was exactly how he preferred it. Linda, of course, saw only an opportunity to perform for an audience. She straightened her perfectly pressed white blouse, smiled the same polished smile she wore at every HOA meeting, and declared that protecting property values sometimes required decisive action. A few nervous neighbors nodded because arguing with her usually meant certified letters, surprise inspections, or expensive fines appearing in your mailbox the following week. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Years working construction had taught me that emotions disappear, but evidence stays forever. I simply looked at the security cameras mounted beneath my roofline, then at the dashboard camera quietly blinking behind the truck's windshield. Every second was being preserved. Every word was already recorded. Linda mistook my silence for surrender. She couldn't have been more wrong. Because the man who had just stepped out of my kitchen carrying 2 paper plates wasn't merely an old friend stopping by for barbecue. And in less than 5 minutes, this quiet suburban street was about to become the last place Linda Whitmore ever wanted to stand in front of a camera. 18 months earlier, I thought I had finally found the kind of neighborhood where life slowed down just enough to hear birds instead of traffic. My name is Ethan Carter. I am 43 years old, and I own a small construction company that specializes in restoring older homes across Central Texas. I have spent more mornings smelling fresh lumber and sawdust than expensive cologne, and I have always believed that if you shake a person's hand firmly, keep your word, and pay your bills on time, life usually works itself out. After selling my previous house outside Austin, I bought a modest place in Willow Creek Estates because it sat on a quiet cul-de-sac with mature oak trees, wide sidewalks, and a backyard large enough to host family cookouts. Every evening, the breeze carried the scent of jasmine from my wife Emily's flower beds while the sound of sprinklers clicked steadily from yard to yard like clockwork. It looked like the picture of the American dream. At first, the homeowners association barely crossed my mind. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn trimmed below 4 inches, painted my fence the approved cedar color, and even attended a few community meetings just to introduce myself. That was where I first met Linda Whitmore. She greeted everyone with a polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. She spoke softly, but every sentence sounded less like a suggestion and more like a decision that had already been made. She liked to remind people how much time she sacrificed for the community, how property values depended on strong leadership, and how rules existed for everyone's benefit. Most residents nodded politely because disagreeing with Linda often turned an ordinary week into an exhausting one. Over the following months, I started noticing small things that never appeared in meeting minutes. A retired schoolteacher received 3 violation notices because her flagpole leaned a few inches after a windstorm. A young couple was fined for leaving a moving trailer in their driveway overnight after their newborn arrived home from the hospital. An elderly veteran quietly replaced his mailbox after Linda insisted the shade of black was not approved. Every story ended the same way. People paid the fine, apologized, and hoped she would move on to someone else. I kept telling myself that staying respectful was the smartest path. I understood contracts, permits, and property law well enough to know that unnecessary arguments rarely solved anything. Besides, I had more important things to focus on. My company was growing, my daughter was preparing for college applications, and weekends were becoming increasingly rare. That was why I had been looking forward to this barbecue for weeks. My oldest friend, Jonathan Hayes, had finally managed to clear his schedule after months of postponed plans. We had known each other since our freshman year at the University of Texas, long before careers, titles, or responsibilities changed our lives. Whenever we got together, none of those things mattered. We were simply 2 friends catching up over smoked brisket, sweet tea, and stories that somehow became funnier every year. If I had known that quiet afternoon would become the moment everything inside Willow Creek Estates started to unravel, I probably still would have lit the grill exactly the same way. Looking back now, I realized Linda Whitmore never cared about pickup trucks, fences, or landscaping. Those were simply tools she used to remind everyone that she believed she was the most important person in Willow Creek Estates. Every Tuesday evening, she drove slowly through the neighborhood in her white Lexus with the windows down, waving politely while scanning every driveway like an inspector searching for violations. The quiet hum of her engine became so familiar that children stopped riding bicycles whenever they saw her coming. Neighbors quietly rolled their trash cans behind fences or closed garage doors before she reached their street. It was amazing how one person could make an entire neighborhood change its routine without ever raising her voice. Linda had been HOA president for almost 6 years, and during that time she had built a reputation that stretched far beyond simple rule enforcement. She loved official letters printed on expensive paper, meetings filled with complicated legal language, and reminding everyone that the association existed to preserve property values. Whenever someone questioned her decisions, she smiled patiently, folded her hands together, and replied, "The board has already reviewed the matter." Most people never even knew who the rest of the board members were. Linda spoke as though she and the HOA were exactly the same thing. The stories traveled quietly from backyard to backyard. Mr. Jenkins, a retired firefighter, paid nearly $1,000 in fines after refusing to remove an antique flagpole that had belonged to his father. A young nurse named Melissa received repeated violation notices because her work schedule sometimes kept her from bringing her trash bin inside before sunset. My next-door neighbor, Carl Benson, spent weeks arguing over a storage trailer that city ordinances clearly allowed, only to give up because the legal fees would have cost more than the trailer itself. None of these incidents made the evening news. They simply wore people down one letter at a time until surrender felt easier than standing their ground. I noticed another pattern that bothered me even more. Linda seemed to enjoy having an audience. Whenever she confronted someone, she somehow managed to do it when other neighbors were outside watering lawns, walking dogs, or collecting mail. She liked witnesses, not because she needed support, but because public embarrassment made people comply faster. Reputation was her favorite weapon. If someone apologized in front of enough neighbors, they usually stopped asking questions afterward. I remember Emily telling me one evening as we watched the sunset paint the oak trees gold, "She is not protecting this neighborhood. She is protecting the image she has built for herself." At the time, I thought my wife was reading too much into it. I wanted to believe every difficult person still had reasonable limits somewhere beneath the surface. I was wrong. Linda had spent years convincing everyone that challenging her was more expensive than obeying her. She believed every resident could eventually be pressured into giving in. What she did not understand was that some people are patient not because they are intimidated, but because they know the truth has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed. That Saturday afternoon, while the smell of slow-smoked brisket drifted across my backyard and cold glasses of sweet tea waited on the patio table, Linda believed she was about to teach another homeowner an unforgettable lesson. She never imagined she was actually setting the stage for her own. Jonathan had arrived just after noon, the familiar rumble of his diesel engine rolling gently through the neighborhood before fading into the quiet. The truck was clean but clearly built for work instead of appearances, with a few dusty miles still clinging to the lower panels from a long drive across the state. He climbed out wearing faded blue jeans, worn leather boots, and a navy ball cap that shaded most of his face. If you passed him in a grocery store, you would have guessed he was a rancher or maybe a contractor stopping in for weekend supplies. That was one thing I always admired about Jonathan. No matter how successful his career became, he never looked or acted like someone searching for attention. We spent the next 20 minutes talking beside the smoker while the smell of seasoned oak drifted through the backyard and the soft hiss of sizzling brisket filled the warm afternoon air. Emily laughed from the patio as she arranged bowls of potato salad and fresh fruit on the picnic table. Everything felt ordinary, exactly the kind of peaceful Saturday we had planned for weeks. Then the mood shifted. The slow electric whir of a golf cart approached from the end of the street. I looked up just in time to see Linda Whitmore pull alongside Jonathan's truck with one of the neighborhood security volunteers riding beside her. The volunteer immediately raised a phone as though he had rehearsed the moment. Linda stepped out, adjusted the sleeves of her crisp white blouse, and walked slowly around the truck with an expression that suggested she had already reached a verdict. She ran one finger across the side of the bed, looked at the faint layer of road dust, and shook her head dramatically. Several neighbors stopped watering their lawns. Others quietly stepped onto their porches. They knew something was about to happen. Linda spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. She announced that oversized commercial vehicles were damaging the appearance of the community and claimed she had warned residents repeatedly about maintaining neighborhood standards. I answered calmly that the truck belonged to my guest, had been parked legally, and would be leaving after dinner. She barely looked at me. Instead, she smiled toward the growing audience as though delivering a prepared speech. According to her, exceptions created chaos, and visible enforcement protected every homeowner's investment. Before I could respond again, she pulled a bright orange emergency window tool from the golf cart storage compartment and struck one of the side windows of the truck, leaving the tempered glass fractured into thousands of tiny pieces that settled onto the driveway with a crisp, unmistakable crackling sound. A few neighbors gasped. Others immediately looked down at the ground, unwilling to become involved. The volunteer continued, recording without saying a word. Linda calmly lowered the tool, brushed an invisible speck of dust from her sleeve, and declared that unauthorized vehicles would no longer disrespect Willow Creek Estates. I felt every eye on me, waiting for an angry reaction. Instead, I quietly reached into my pocket, opened the security camera application on my phone, and confirmed that every second had been captured from 3 different angles. Then I glanced toward the front door as it slowly opened and Jonathan stepped outside carrying 2 paper plates, completely unaware that the peaceful afternoon had just changed forever. Jonathan stopped at the edge of the porch, balancing 2 paper plates topped with brisket and baked beans as though nothing unusual had happened. The smell of smoked oak still floated through the backyard, but now it mixed with the faint scent of shattered safety glass warming under the afternoon sun. He looked from me to the truck, then to Linda, calmly taking in the entire scene without asking a single question. That was another thing about Jonathan. He never rushed to conclusions. Years of experience had taught him to observe first and speak second. I walked over, accepted one of the plates, and quietly set both of them on the patio table before either of us said a word. Linda interpreted our silence exactly the way I expected. She folded her arms, smiled toward the neighbors gathered along the sidewalks, and announced that compliance always won in the end. According to her, people who ignored community standards eventually learned expensive lessons. The security volunteer kept recording with his phone, occasionally glancing around as if waiting for someone to applaud. Instead, the neighborhood remained strangely quiet. Even the usual sound of lawn mowers had disappeared. All anyone could hear was the steady clicking of sprinklers and the distant chirping of birds in the oak trees. Jonathan finally walked toward the truck with an unhurried pace. He examined the fractured side window, carefully brushing a few tiny pieces of glass from the door handle without showing the slightest sign of anger. Then he looked up at one of my security cameras mounted beneath the garage roof and gave a small nod. I knew exactly what that meant. He had already noticed what Linda had overlooked. Every angle of the driveway was covered. The dashboard camera inside the truck had also remained active since he arrived. Without raising his voice, Jonathan asked a simple question. Did anyone get hurt? I answered honestly. No, just the truck. He nodded once more, almost relieved, and reached into the cab through the open window to retrieve a slim leather portfolio. Linda laughed softly and shook her head. You can save the paperwork, she said. Our attorneys have handled situations like this before. Jonathan did not respond. Instead, he opened the portfolio, removed a notepad, and began writing the exact time, weather conditions, vehicle position, and names he had already heard spoken aloud. His handwriting was slow, neat, and methodical. Every few moments he paused to study another detail before continuing. The neighbors exchanged confused looks. This was not the confrontation they expected. Linda tried once more to provoke a reaction by reminding everyone that the association existed to protect responsible homeowners from people who ignored the rules. Still, neither of us argued. I simply opened the cloud storage application on my phone and confirmed that 3 separate camera feeds had already uploaded successfully. The quiet notification tone sounded almost insignificant, but hearing it gave me a sense of calm I cannot fully describe. Linda believed she had finished writing the story. What she failed to understand was that everything she had done during the last 5 minutes had only completed the opening chapter. The real record of that afternoon had already been preserved, second by second, and it was far more detailed than anyone standing on that driveway could possibly imagine. Jonathan finished his notes, closed the leather portfolio with an almost inaudible snap, and slipped it beneath his arm. The neighborhood had grown so quiet that I could hear the faint buzz of cicadas rising from the oak trees behind my fence. Even the security volunteer slowly lowered his phone, uncertain whether he should keep recording. Linda, however, still carried herself with complete confidence. She took one step closer and reminded Jonathan that Willow Creek Estates had strict architectural standards, parking policies, and enforcement authority. According to her, every homeowner and every guest agreed to respect those rules the moment they entered the community. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When she finally finished speaking, he asked one simple question. Are you the person who made the decision to damage my vehicle? Linda answered immediately. Yes. As president of this association, I made that decision to protect the neighborhood. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She believed the statement strengthened her position. Jonathan gave a slow nod, as though confirming the final piece of information he needed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a dark leather credential wallet that looked old from years of daily use. He opened it just long enough for Linda to read the official identification inside. I watched the color drain from her face almost instantly. The confidence that had filled her voice only seconds earlier disappeared without a sound. Her eyes moved from the credential to Jonathan's face and then back again, as though she hoped she had misunderstood what she was seeing. Jonathan spoke in the same calm tone he had used all afternoon. My name is Jonathan Hayes. I serve as the Attorney General for this state. Today I am here as a private citizen visiting a longtime friend, but I am also the owner of this vehicle. Nobody said a word. The afternoon breeze rustled the leaves overhead, while somewhere across the street a wind chime softly rang against its metal frame. The security volunteer quietly lowered his phone to his side. 2 neighbors who had been standing near the sidewalk exchanged wide-eyed glances, but remained perfectly still. Linda attempted a nervous smile that never fully formed. She cleared her throat and said there must have been some misunderstanding. Jonathan politely shook his head. There is no misunderstanding, he replied. Your own statement was recorded by multiple cameras, including the recording your volunteer made a few moments ago. He looked toward me for only a second before continuing. Evidence has a remarkable way of preserving facts exactly as they happened. Linda glanced toward my garage, finally noticing the cameras she had ignored earlier. Then she looked toward the truck, where the dashboard camera indicator still blinked steadily behind the windshield. I could almost see the afternoon replaying itself inside her mind, one decision after another. Jonathan removed his phone, placed a brief call, and identified himself without raising his voice. He requested that an investigator document a property damage incident involving recorded evidence and asked for the appropriate reporting procedures. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he ended the call, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked directly at Linda. "From this point forward," he said quietly, "everything will proceed according to the law." The first official vehicle arrived less than 20 minutes later, but by then the atmosphere on our street had already changed. The same neighbors who had quietly watched from a distance began walking toward my driveway one by one, not to gossip, but to observe. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from someone's porch while the afternoon sun reflected off thousands of tiny glass fragments that still covered the concrete. Jonathan remained remarkably calm. He never raised his voice or issued dramatic commands. Instead, he greeted the responding investigator with a firm handshake, identified himself once again, and stepped aside so the documentation process could begin exactly the way it would for any other citizen. The investigator photographed every angle of the truck, measured the location of the vehicle, collected the small emergency window tool that Linda had left resting on the golf cart seat, and requested copies of every available recording. I transferred the files from my home security system directly from the cloud. Jonathan removed the dashboard camera memory card and handed it over. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Jenkins, the retired firefighter, quietly approached carrying a neatly labeled folder. He explained that he had spent years saving every violation notice, every certified letter, and every email he had received from the association. Melissa, the nurse from 3 streets over, arrived with photographs showing fines she believed had never been authorized under the governing documents. Carl Benson walked over holding survey maps, invoices, and copies of correspondence about the trailer dispute that had cost him months of frustration. Within half an hour, my driveway looked less like the scene of a neighborhood disagreement and more like the beginning of a community history that had finally found someone willing to read every page. Jonathan accepted nothing immediately. Instead, he encouraged each resident to submit their information through the proper legal channels so every document could be reviewed fairly and independently. His words were simple. Facts matter. Records matter. Procedures matter. Hearing those 3 sentences seemed to give people permission to speak openly for the first time in years. Stories that had been whispered across backyard fences suddenly became signed statements supported by photographs, emails, receipts, meeting minutes, and recordings. Linda stood several yards away, her confident posture slowly disappearing as more neighbors gathered. She tried to explain that every decision had been made for the benefit of the community, but this time nobody interrupted the residents who were calmly describing their own experiences. There was no shouting, no chaos, only quiet voices supported by organized evidence. The security volunteer who had eagerly recorded the afternoon earlier now walked over to the investigator and voluntarily offered the complete video from his phone without being asked twice. That recording captured Linda's own statements from beginning to end with remarkable clarity. I watched Jonathan glance briefly toward me before looking back at the growing stack of documents resting on the hood of his truck. The damaged window had brought everyone together, but it was no longer the center of the story. It had simply become the moment when years of silence finally gave way to accountability, and for the first time since I moved into Willow Creek Estates, the balance of power no longer belonged to the loudest person in the neighborhood. It belonged to the evidence. The following week felt different from anything I had experienced since moving into Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood was still quiet, but it was no longer the uneasy silence that comes from people avoiding conflict. It was the patient silence of people waiting for facts to finish their work. Every morning, investigators arrived with clipboards, cameras, and document boxes instead of assumptions. They measured, photographed, cataloged, and compared records with the kind of precision I appreciated from years in construction. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from open garages as neighbors watched from their driveways, no longer afraid to greet one another. Jonathan returned to his regular responsibilities, but before leaving he reminded every resident that the process would be handled fairly and according to the law. He made no promises about outcomes. He only promised that every piece of evidence would receive the same careful review. Over the next several weeks, that promise proved stronger than any speech. Financial records from the association were examined alongside meeting minutes, violation notices, email chains, contractor invoices, and homeowner complaints that stretched back several years. patterns slowly emerged. Several fines had been issued without proper board approval. Certain expenditures lacked complete supporting documentation. Some enforcement actions appeared inconsistent with the governing documents that every homeowner had agreed to when purchasing property. None of those discoveries came from rumors. They came from paperwork, signatures, dates, and records that had quietly existed all along. Linda attempted to defend her decisions during a special association meeting held at the clubhouse, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Residents who once avoided speaking now arrived carrying organized binders instead of nervous expressions. They asked respectful questions and requested clear explanations supported by official records. For the first time since I had known her, Linda could not rely on confident speeches alone. Every answer was followed by another document. Every explanation was compared against another record. The confidence that had once filled the room slowly gave way to uncomfortable pauses. Within a month, the remaining board members voted to appoint independent legal counsel to review the association's administrative practices. Soon afterward, Linda announced her resignation as president, explaining that she wished to focus on personal matters. No applause followed. No celebration broke out. Most people simply nodded quietly, understanding that accountability did not require dramatic moments. It required honest records and patient people willing to protect them. The association began reorganizing under temporary leadership, while updated financial audits and policy reviews continued. Several homeowners who had previously paid disputed fines received notices that their cases would be reevaluated according to the governing documents. Mr. Jenkins smiled for what felt like the first time in years when he learned his long-disputed flagpole issue would finally receive an independent review. Melissa thanked the volunteers helping organize archived records. Carl laughed as he joked that filing cabinets had become the busiest part of the neighborhood. Standing in my driveway one evening, I noticed workers carefully replacing the damaged window in Jonathan's truck. The fresh glass reflected the setting sun exactly where the fractured pieces had once covered the concrete. Watching that reflection, I realized the truck had never been the real story. It had simply become the moment when one careless decision exposed years of unchecked authority. Everything that followed came from ordinary people who finally understood that truth becomes remarkably powerful when it is organized, documented, and allowed to speak for itself. 3 months later, Willow Creek Estates looked almost exactly the same from the outside, but living there felt completely different. The same oak trees shaded the sidewalks. The same sprinklers clicked on every evening just before sunset. The same children rode bicycles through the cul-de-sac, while neighbors waved from their front porches. Yet something invisible had changed. Fear no longer shaped everyday life. The association elected a new board made up of residents from different parts of the neighborhood, people who believed meetings should answer questions instead of creating them. Every agenda, financial report, and policy update became available to every homeowner before each meeting. Decisions were explained instead of announced. The atmosphere shifted from control to cooperation, one careful step at a time. Mr. Jenkins finally restored the antique flagpole that had belonged to his father. Melissa no longer worried about receiving another unexpected violation notice after finishing a 12-hour hospital shift. Carl parked his trailer exactly where the governing documents allowed, and for the first time nobody questioned it. Emily joked that our neighborhood newsletter had become surprisingly boring, and I took that as the highest compliment possible. Quiet neighborhoods are supposed to be boring. That is what people pay for when they buy a home. Jonathan visited again the following spring. The repaired truck rolled into my driveway with the same familiar diesel rumble, except this time several neighbors walked over carrying lawn chairs instead of worried expressions. We spent the afternoon smoking brisket, telling old stories, and laughing about college memories that somehow grew funnier every year. No one cared what title Jonathan held. Around my backyard, he was simply my oldest friend. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, its reflection stretched across the perfectly replaced side window of his truck. Watching the light dance across that clear glass reminded me of the thousands of tiny fragments that had once covered this same driveway. Back then, I thought the broken window was the biggest problem I would face. I could not have been more mistaken. It turned out that the damaged glass was only the crack that allowed years of hidden problems to come into view. I have replayed that afternoon in my mind many times since then, and the lesson never changes. Real authority does not need loud speeches, public humiliation, or constant reminders of power. It does not depend on titles, printed on business cards, or names engraved on office doors. Real authority respects the law even when nobody is watching. Linda believed silence meant weakness. She believed ordinary people would always choose convenience over truth. What she never understood was that patience is often mistaken for surrender, and documentation is stronger than intimidation. Every security camera, every recorded statement, every saved email, every carefully organized folder became another piece of a story that facts refused to let disappear. Standing on my front porch that evening, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass and charcoal drifting through the neighborhood, I finally understood something my father used to tell me whenever a difficult job tested my patience. You do not build anything that lasts by cutting corners. The same rule applies to communities, reputations, and justice. Justice is not loud. It does not arrive in a hurry. It simply waits until the truth has nowhere left to hide, and then it speaks for itself.